Welcome everyone. The Targeting AI podcast is doing something different this episode. If you're one of our audio listeners, you might not notice anything different, but we are now testing out a new video portion, so you can now watch us and our guests online on YouTube. Tech Target's YouTube is eyeontech, so check us out on there. But moving on, today we are excited to welcome Warren Barkley, Senior Director of Product Management at Google Cloud. Warren is also a professor at BIMM University in England. He has also worked for AWS and Microsoft. Thank you so much for joining us on the Targeting AI podcast, Warren.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk to you guys.
So we can't wait to dive into Google Cloud's AI strategy, but we'd like to start with getting to know a little bit more about you, Warren. So how did you get into AI and what made you want to focus on the technology?
Yeah, that's very cool. 10, 12 years ago, maybe now, I was running a company with a friend of mine called Smart Technologies as EdTech. And we had a lot of data about kids learning and things like that. And so one of my research folks came to me and said, hey, we should really spend some time and figure out if there's something we could do with AI. And it would, relatively nascent at the time. And so we actually, at that point, partnered with Google Cloud. This is back 2013-ish type of time frame, and started working with them on figuring out if we could figure out, what learning outcomes actually make a difference in a child's journey around mathematics and things like that. And so that was kind of when it started for me. And I just kind of fell in love with it and just dug in from that point, and then have been doing it for the last 10 years or so. But that was kind of the genesis for me. I was kind of looking at like what's next in tech. And at that point, it's just starting to be nascent, and it was very cool stuff.
Yes, super cool. So you've basically had a chance to work for all three of the top US cloud providers, right? What would you say are the key similarities between the three cloud providers and their approach to AI, and what are their differences?
They're all slightly different actually in how they're kind of approaching this whole area. And it's obvious there's strengths and weaknesses of each company, and they kind of go after it. And so if you look at Google, we have a huge research arm, huge strength within that. And so our ability to kind of build new models and, be the inventor of of the early LLMs and large models and things like that gives us kind of a unique position, because we have all the tooling that we use to build that, and then we're giving that to our customers. Plus, we also have a bunch of friends like Anthropic and Mistral and things like that who are part of our ecosystem. And so, I think from a strength perspective, we have, first party friends models and open source models, and we're bringing the tooling that we have that we used and we built for our customers. So I think we're slightly different than the others in that way. So.
Okay, so you've been at Google for more than 3 years now. So how's your job changed from when you first arrived, and then generative AI exploded shortly after, I think, after you arrived, even though it had been around in various forms, it burst into the public consciousness and enterprise use of it in about 2.5 years ago. So how did that go?
Yeah, it was, we had obviously been experimenting with it for a long time, and we had it in production actually in a bunch of our properties for a while. But bringing it to customers was kind of tough, because how do we do that? It's really expensive. But there was this tipping point where you had enough processing data acceleration where you could start to do that. And actually, I remember really specifically, I was sitting and I got an email from Thomas Kurian, the CEO of Google Cloud, saying, hey, what are we doing with generative? And we had a team working on it. But he said, hey, is there a way do we need to expand and do more with this? And at that point, it was like, a gun went off in some respects. And we just started jumping crazily on that horse and riding it. And what has happened for me and my job has changed is that, we used to see major iteratives, maybe 9 or 12 months in major breakthroughs. We're now seeing that in weeks. And in fact, when I go to bed at night and the folks in London at DeepMind are working, it may very well be when I wake up in the morning, they've had another breakthrough and they're like, hey, this is new tech that we need to figure out how to get to customers. That's a very different thing than in the past. where things moved a little bit more slowly, and the innovations came stepwise.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, how do you deal with that? Because if you remember at the very beginning of generative AI, well, not beginning of generative AI, but beginning of ChatGPT, it seems like every new week. I feel like last year, every week, there was always a new thing being introduced. How, as someone at Google, how did you deal with that pace, right, of trying to match up of like, oh, AW has got this, then Chat OpenAI, then Microsoft. How did you guys deal with that?
Oh wait, but didn't Bard come out like a week after ChatGPT, maybe?
Yeah, yeah, it was very quickly. I think that the for us looking at what's going on in the industry is just, we have the big research muscle, and that's great because when I go talk to Eli and DeepMind or Gemma or Dave Thacker or any of these folks who are like right in the middle of it, I can call them up in the morning going, "Hey, what's going on?" They give me insights into things. And so that's part of it. The other part of it, you just got to be very aware and watching what's going on. Um, and it's beyond leaderboards and like things like that, but also, what are customers doing and how are they, faring with this? And so I don't know if this has changed that much, but certainly the pace of my customer conversations and how many times I talk to, CTOs in different parts of the world and things like that, this is the conversation we're having. It's like, what are you doing and how is it working? Is it working or not working? What do we need to do to make it better? That's pretty straightforward stuff, but the pace of that has gone from, running at 5 miles an hour to running at 30 miles an hour. So
I can imagine. And also, like, Google obviously is known as an AI company and very well sees itself as an AI company before all this explosion happened. The rise of generative AI obviously led to some changes, like you were just speaking about. What changes did Google make to its overall cloud strategy with the popularity of generative AI, and how much risk was involved with any of these moves?
one of the great things was when we came into this, we had all the tools and we had the platform. And that was a big deal because we had the things that wrap around it. And so more than just kind of having a big model out there that people could consume, for us, it was how do we make sure that we extend these tools to make them work beyond kind of more predictive technologies that we've had in the past. And so for us, it was a lot of doing that. And then also making sure that you're keeping pace with the next generation, the next generation, the next generation. So a lot of what we did in the early days and we continue to do now is like, how do we make it really easy for people to go to the next generation and continue to move forward? And that's, one thing that is a very different in enterprise software, because in enterprise software, it's, hey, I have this product that's out there for a bunch of years. I built some stuff on it. And then 5 years from now, I go look at it. Now, the models that we built 18 months ago are a shadow of the things that we have today. And so making sure that you have ways for people to upgrade and continue to get that innovation, is a big part of some of the things that we had to change. So.
You mentioned the model you built 18 months ago. How is your planning strategy? Like, are you always 18 months ahead, or do you have years into, like, what is the competition and doing? Like, how do you plan that?
Yeah, there's like kind of two streams. It's a very interesting question. I mean, because a lot of people ask me, hey, I want your 2025 roadmap or 2026. And it's like, well, 26, I have no idea. Like, to be honest, like, and anybody who says they have an idea, I kind of question that. I think, from now at this point, like the planning horizon on at least model innovation is probably in the 6 month, maybe 8 month range. On tools, it's a little bit easier. So like if you're thinking about things like, I want to use LangChain for as an orchestration, or I want to build, agents and some of the tools around that, though they're changing and they're updating and things, they're a little bit easier to plan for. But certainly when it comes to the core innovation piece, that's moving so quickly that anything more than about 6 to 8 months out is really tough to see. So.
It's funny because my next question was going to be a roadmap question. So let's see if I can tweak it a little bit. So Gemini is Google's main language model, large language model for enterprises and consumers. And I know you host a ton of other models on Vertex AI and work with other vendors and all that stuff. But that's your main one. And I know DeepMind has some others, and you have some others. But And Gemini is also the AI assistant. So, how has Google's vision with Gemini changed since its initial introduction? And what further changes can users anticipate with Gemini, like new modes, perhaps in the multimodal system? How much is it going to progress?
Yeah, I think what's kind of changed from the past to now is a lot of things around uh, a lot around modalities. What you're talking about, multimodal, and so with Gemini today, you can ingest audio, speech, video, text, and it has understanding of that. The thing that's kind of you're seeing emerging right now is reasoning, and so you have some kind of basic reasoning. That reasoning is now becoming much more complicated, and so we're seeing the ability to do kind of much more kind of extended multi kind of turn reasoning with the model. And so I will see definitely that. We'll also see more multimodal support that continue to expand so the model understands more about the way that we are, right? Like how do we see how do we understand? Model continues to get better and better at that. And so I think that's the kind of one of the frontiers. The other one is, and this is taking off in very interesting ways, is this whole big context window. So I now can have 1 million, 2 million token context windows, which effectively means I can take 60,000 lines of code, or an entire series of books, or the quarterly statements for 4 companies for 5 years or whatever, and ingest them, and then ask the model to make some sort of kind of deliberate over those. That's an area that I still think is still slightly nascent, and we're seeing new things all the time. So hey, you know what? I'm a media company and I want to find these things in this video. I want the plot in this video. I want to understand those types of things, or I want the audio from the earnings call together with the actual earnings statements to see, how do those things line up, and those types of things. We're seeing that type of thing really kind of start to pop. And I think that those scenarios and use cases are still kind of new, and people are trying to figure it out. And so that's one thing that I think we're going to see more and more of around that type of stuff. So
I hate to ask this, but I have to. What about the fabled AGI? I know that is DeepMind's area, if there is an area. Um, is Google? Are you guys at all pursuing that, and how?
it's like one of those things where uh, I think that we continue to try to figure out ways to make the model smarter, quote unquote, and reason better. But that is, seems to be for me a heck of a long way away, right? And where exactly and when some of that stuff actually happens, I think a lot of people assume things that we're closer to that than we necessarily are. And part of that is like simple human things. Can you fool the model in very simple ways by covering up something or changing something in some way? Their answer is yes. Most people could understand, hey, by the way, there's a piece of paper across this thing and that's what's going on. Model doesn't have that understanding. And so I think that we're quite a ways away from that world. But as we look at continuing to add reasoning and understanding into the model, it grows in its effectiveness and its efficiency to be able to do more interesting tasks. But for me, at least my personal opinion is that it's quite a long ways away. And I'd say that when us AI type people get together, and there is no dark smoky room, to be clear, but when we get together and talk about it, it's often kind of a bit of a joke, right? Because it's like, oh, hey, AGI, when are you going to be there, type of thing, and we kind of laugh a little bit about it because it just seems improbably long away. So yeah.
Sort of like the Fountain of
Yeah.
Youth or something. But thanks.
Yes, I'm still working on that. It's not working. I don't know. My moisturizer hasn't done anything for me. So yeah. So,
That's so funny. I wanted to kind of ask about the context window, right? Because we're seeing context windows grow larger and larger. And as someone who covers AI, it's kind of like, so what's interesting about this model when and they're like, oh, the context window is larger. Do you think that Gemini is going to go any larger, or are we going to cap at the context window? And also, do you think that the more context window we have, the larger room there is for error?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think that first of all, at this point, there's not. You could do 4 million, 6 million, 8 million token context windows. It's possible. Even 10 million is possible. And so the question really is how like unwieldy that does that become, and how much information do you want to feed the model at one time on that turn of the model? Now, what we did couple months ago is we introduced what's called context caching, which basically allows you to take 2 million tokens of stuff and put it in there and then ask the question multiple times with that context as the cache. So you don't have to actually feed the model that information multiple times. It's very interesting. We're seeing very interesting use cases on that of people going, yeah, I have like the policy books for all my life insurance, health insurance, whatever, which are tens and tens of thousands of pages. And I want to be able to ask lots of different interesting questions on that. Well, context caching works really well. I have yet to see a reason to have a 10 million token context window, but I certainly do not want to make the mistake that others in the past have, is that 64K is all the memory we're ever going to need. So I think it's just it may get there, but we're listening to customers pretty closely on that right now. And if they decide that they think that's bigger, then we'll see how we can go there.
We also wanted to kind of ask about, obviously you guys released Imagen 3 recently, and you also reopened the image generating feature back up after having to shut it down earlier this year. And so Imagen 3 would not let users generate images of people again. What would you say was the biggest lesson learned from that hiccup with when the image generating feature was first released and the Gemini imaging feature was malfunctioning?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing that we went kind of, and that's like a super interesting story around image generation and how do you do it safely and with secure, kind of with societal. And actually, we just had this conversation last week with the safety and my team, which was around, what are we doing when we're thinking about safety? How do we put it in context? And it's like, hey, what do the customers care about? What does the society care about? Are we protecting the customers? Are we protecting society? Are we protecting ourselves? Maybe in that order, but not necessarily. But I think that when we dug into what that really was, it's a question of like, how do you actually filter the input and the output and give people control over that? And so in the API, if you go call the Imagen API, you'll find that it actually will give you kind of responses as an app developer. It says, hey, in these categories, this is where you're kind of trending towards, something that's dangerous. And so you can actually, as an app developer, kind of look at that and understand that, and get some idea about like, oh, hey, this part of the world, this is not acceptable. And so I'm going to make sure that category, if that triggers, I'm never going to let that image out. And so I think that there's some of that stuff, but also it's a question of making sure that we have some base things that are built into the model, and that's one thing that I think is become much more sophisticated, is our ability to look at the prompt and look at the output in the model when the model's actually doing its work to say, hey, is this safe or not? As opposed to historically, it was much more a filter. Like, hey, this language and these words, I'm a little scared about. And this output I'm a little scared about. Now the model has more intelligence about what it's seeing, and in that pace has just made the model much better and much safer.
Okay, so thanks for that. Just pivoting a little toward Vertex AI, which was around before the explosion of generative AI. I always thought of it as a machine learning platform, but now it's also obviously enables developers to build generative AI systems and experiences. So Vertex AI Studio also lets users test and use, I don't know how many models, maybe 100 or whatever. Why is it important to give enterprises access not only to Gemini but also to popular LLMs and models from many other vendors?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for us, there are a lot of options, and people want options, right, around some of this stuff. And it's like, when you go to the grocery store, if there was only one type of mustard, you'd be probably pretty disappointed. Um, and so you may want hot and spicy mustard or not. And part of that is making sure that people have choice within that. So if they have a need or something where Mistral or Code Strahl or whatever is a better option for them because maybe it meets their latency requirements, their cost requirements, their quality requirements, whatever. Then we have it there. And so it's really a question of allowing people to use our kind of rich tooling, but have choice within that. And though we're super proud of Gemini and we think it does many things amazingly well, there are reasons why you might want to choose a smaller llama model or something like that for some use. And so we want to make sure that people have that choice. I think the one thing that's very interesting now is how do you actually help them choose? And that's a place where we've recently released a bunch of stuff tooling around evaluation. And so this quick evaluation service where you put a prompt in and then you can put a model against it and say, this is what I think the output should be. And it'll actually let you compare prompts and kind of look and see what sort of quality you get and compare models as well and do some evaluation. And I think that's one thing that our most sophisticated customers are struggling with is how to actually evaluate models. And so we've given people that tooling so that they can choose the 150 whatever models and kind of use that and figure out if that's the best one for them.
Okay, so quickly follow up. How is this multi-model strategy as opposed to multimodal? I always get confused by that. How how is it at all similar to like the multi-cloud approach that enterprises want? Is it similar to that? Because I know Google plays well with others, and you even have some competitors models on in the model garden in Vertex AI, such as Llama. So, could you just talk about that just a little, please?
Historically with Vertex, have built the product in a componentized way because we know some people want to do distributed training or something like that, and they want to use some open source piece, but they want to use us for inference or different things like that. There's like a combination of tooling that you can use, and there may have various reasons why that's true. And so for us, this models was just kind of an extension of that, which was, hey, if you want to have, if you have some sort of reason that you want this type of model there and you want to use that model, now does that give you portability? I think somewhat, in the respect that, hey, this prompt that I tuned and built for this specific model could work on multiple clouds. That's probably the case, but it's not necessarily the case. And I think that it gives you probably some flexibility, but it doesn't give you the ultimate flexibility. One thing that uh, I think that when you look at kind of the multi-cloud thing, there's like always kind of some pros and cons that go along with that. Some of those pros and cons exist within the model stuff as well. So, but it does give you more kind of portability in some respects. So.
Still on the same line of questioning, I've always wondered, and because I feel like you're not the only one to have like multiple models, right? AWS also has multiple models. Google, Microsoft also has multiple models. So when you're kind of like pitching to like new customers, obviously you're Google, right? So that's, you have the name, but what is really the pitch here, right? Because others have the same. Wouldn't you say?
Neither of those companies have their own model. They borrow from other people. So uh, that's probably the first thing I say when I get asked that question. But I think that that's one piece of it, certainly. I think the other piece of it, as kind of the leading research organization uh, who invented a bunch of this stuff. We also have the tooling that we used when we built it that we're exposing to customers within Vertex so that they can use things like more advanced value evaluation, so they can use different types of training techniques and things like that. Adapter based fine tuning, which is like super cheap as opposed to full base fine tuning. And so we're talking like for adapter based fine tuning, you may spend a couple $100 and get a very similar result to doing full fine tuning, which is going to cost you thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so some of these things are things that we have. And I think that differentiates us from those other folks. But yeah, often the first thing that comes up is like, we have our own model.
That's a great answer. So, you spoke a little bit about Llama and Mistral. You mentioned them, and there was for a while there was this like kind of closed and open source, I guess, conversation regarding models that comes up. What would you say is Google's cloud stance on open and closed source? Vertex AI provides access to open models such as Mistral and Llama. What are the benefits of having both open and closed models?
Yeah, I think that it depends on who you are and what you're trying to do on whether you want to pick an open or closed model. And I think that in many, I'd say that if you kind of look from a purely a performance perspective today, closed models have an edge in a lot of places. But open models, hey, I've got a ton of data. I got terabytes of data. I want to use this data to make something very unique and very specific. And people, that's where, open source makes a lot of sense. The other piece though with that is that you also have to be a company that has the sophistication and the people to go do that, because it's not straightforward in the respect of like, hey, I got an open source model, I want to go customize it. Hey, we give you all the tooling for that. We make it relatively easy, but you still have to have a certain level of sophistication around what are you doing with that model, and how are you doing it. And so I think that it just depends on the company, and there's some companies that it makes total sense for them to pick up Llama 405 and do something with it. But you have to have a reason for that, and that reason needs to be probably more than, hey, I want to use an open model and I don't want to use a closed one. It has to be like, I have a business reason why this is the thing I need to use, because that's the only tool to get there. Because the reality is it's probably more expensive and probably more difficult to get to the outcome using an open model necessarily than a closed one. But that's not always the case. So I think that it's a question of, you got to look at what your resources are and how deep you want to dig.
So a lot of analysts that Esther talks to in her stories say that we're moving from ideation to implementation of generative AI technology in enterprises. So we're fully in that phase now. So would you agree with that? And what are the main use cases with Gemini that Google is starting to see with companies and enterprises?
Yeah, I think that we have the early-ish kind of experimenters, and I do believe that there is last year. Like if you kind of look at last year, one of the things that we saw was you sit down with a customer and you go, "Hey, what do you want to build?" And they said, "Well, my board told me I have to do something with generative AI." That often was a response, not always, but you got it quite a bit. We've gone from that to, "Hey, I figured out this. I want to put this thing in production." And so we do see like a nonlinear increase of what I would consider POCs going to production. So I think that is quite true. And we are seeing scaling, even nonlinear scaling in the way of turns on the model and the number of people who are looking in where SLAs are important and SLOs are important and reliability is important. And when you start hearing those things, people are going into production. So yes, I agree with that. That is definitely, we've turned a corner on that. What do people doing with it? I think that there's a bunch of people doing support like stuff, right? Chatbot-y, agent assist-y, kind of those types of things. Another thing that I see a cluster of is how do I do question and answer across very complicated document sets? And there's the whole RAG thing, which, by the way, I have some very sophisticated customers who struggle with that. RAG is not easy. I think that a lot of people pretend it is, but it's not. I think it's kind of tough. But as part of that is, we have this grounding ability for you to ground in your own data. And so you can actually take the model and ground it in a corpus of technical data. And so we have an auto manufacturer who does that. We have a healthcare company who does that. So they can actually have an app front end that allows them to go and say, hey, what is the manifold pressure for this turbo? And it can actually come back and tell you, hey, it's X number of PSI, and that's what it is. There's 20, 30,000 pages of documentation that they would have had to figure out how to find that answer in that, or even more sophisticated answers is when these two policies happen, what do I do? We see that as well. And so, being able to ground in your own data to get answers ends up being a really important thing. We see that quite a bit. I guess the last piece is we're seeing kind of a more sophisticated analysis of different types of media and documentation. So some of the things I talked about a little bit earlier, like, hey, I have an audio recording of an earnings call. I've got, the earnings statements and things like that. Can I ask some sophisticated questions about what is in that and what is, how do these things match up and those things? We see, people asking sophisticated questions on unstructured data that they couldn't ask before. So we see quite a bit of that. So those are kind of a few examples. There's definitely more. We're definitely seeing more agent type people starting to do agent type stuff, but that's kind of a different level. We can talk more about that if you want. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually going to be the next question because I spoke to Jason Gelman about 3 weeks ago, who's Google's director of product management for Vertex AI, and we talked about AI agents. So, can you speak about AI agents? What exactly are they? And it seems like there's a little bit of an underground excitement about it. I see Google is saying that it's probably the next kind of generative AI thing. And how is that?
Yeah, I think that there's like agents you kind of look at, and by the way, it's kind of like one of those terms that gets a little out of control in some respects because it's like, okay, what are agents? And what is the secret sauce? Agents are in some respects applications, right? They're kind of apps that sit with models. I think that there's two pieces to the agent experience. One is really kind of is an orchestration piece, which is, hey, I asked this question, and the model takes it, it runs something, and then gets an answer to that based on whatever, and then it goes into some logic, and it may actually use multiple different models to figure out what the logic is that it needs to go. So there's kind of two pieces to this kind of world, but we're seeing a lot more. Some pretty sophisticated things starting to happen where people are using that kind of agent experience where they want to string model question and answers or terms or queries, whatever you want to call, together to kind of make it then do an action. And then what that action is based on some logic. And what does that mean? Well, it means in some respects that you are starting to see much more sophisticated kind of assistant scenarios start to come up with, like, hey, I need you to go get all this information and find it, bring it back, summarize it, and create a report for me. That is not, and you can say that, and people have said that 5 years ago, but the reality of doing that without you having to get in the middle of it in a lot of ways was pretty tough. Now those types of things are becoming much more real. And so we're seeing a lot of those types of things just kind of start to pop. And I do believe that, when we look at like, how do I get value out of this thing, that's definitely an accelerant to this whole world.
Okay, thanks for that. You touched on this earlier, but we want to speak a little bit more about AI safety. So what is Google Cloud's strategy on AI safety in regard to AI agents and generative AI?
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about it. I think it's really important. We take it very seriously. And even you can see in some of how we're releasing things and, the way that we release things, we're probably a little bit more conservative than some other folks. And part of that is because we really, really take the safety thing seriously. There are many ways that we make the model safe. There's some things that are inherently in the model. I'd say that what I'm seeing now is the model itself is becoming much more safe itself. You don't have to wrap it with as much stuff. But for us, there's different types of harms, and making sure that we are, broadly understanding what those harms are and how they're being applied. And making sure that we're out in the world watching for those things is super important. I think that the other piece of it is that we also have to respect the fact that, let me give you an example. So, I'm a lawyer, and I do, accident claim stuff. The report that I get that said, hey, someone, hit a pole and they, bruised their forehead and they got a bloody nose or whatever and things like that. If you have less sophisticated safety systems, that'll just kind of block, because it's like, oh, that's violence. Well, it's actually a totally inappropriate thing. And so you have to be very nuanced about what you can and can't do with that. And we pour just an epic amount of time and energy into thinking about that and trying to make sure that, we're kind of on the right side for that. So it's a pretty sophisticated, and it's a very difficult area. I'd say that the other piece of it is that where we're kind of focusing quite a bit on is like when we think about multimodal and some of those things, it's like, okay, image generation, those types. How do you do that type of stuff? One of the things that we launched quite a while ago was Synth ID, which is basically, hey, can we mark the image to make sure that you can actually go and check, hey, is this an AI generated image? Yes or no? And you know that it is. If you know that it is, then you can definitely make sure that that's understood in the world. And so we're doing things like that, and there'll be more things like that to make sure that people understand this is AI generated and this is where it came from.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder though, with the what you just mentioned, it's kind of like it's almost like, I don't want to call it watermarking, but you're uh there's been some controversies with that as well, in regards to sometimes it will be marked as AI generated, but it's just like a use of like an editing feature. So how are you working to differentiate between truly AI generated, like AI completely generated this, or then versus I just use a tool?
Yeah, I think that it's so basically what you're asking is like AI generated as opposed to AI enhanced. Yeah, and I think that for us today, what we're doing is, we're kind of defaulting on the, I would say, more conservative side of that, which is like if you take something and you replace the background in it with a model, that will get effectively watermarked, because you're doing a pretty you're AI generating a background. So you're putting this dog that was in Paris now it looks like it's in London. That's a pretty big change. And so marking that type of thing ends up being important. I think that there is some nuance there, but for us, it's we're trying to be fairly conservative to mark rather than less, because we think that whether it was edited by AI or generated by AI, you're doing some pretty big changes to the image because of it. And so people knowing that, it's easily explainable. If the dog's in London and it was actually taking a picture in Paris and you didn't mark it, then then there would be no way to know that had actually happened to the image. But yeah, it's a difficult area.
I have another question. Sorry, about I wanted to ask about mixture of experts. Do you know anything about that? You talked about RAG, retrieval augmentation generation later before, but what about mixture of experts? Are you guys working with that at all?
Yeah, some of our models use mixture of experts in behind the scenes to get the right answers. I think the interesting part is as we move forward and you'll start to see some of this from us, which is, and we get customers who ask for it, is, hey, I'm not exactly sure which model to pick. And there's kind of like but I have this query. I know what this query looks like. This is what my prompt looks like. Okay, great. Which model should I pick with that? And so you see little bits from us already of basically kind of model routing. Oh, hey, based on this prompt, you should probably route it to this type of model, with this type of sophistication and things like that. I think you're going to see more and more of that, where it's like, hey, you don't necessarily need to choose the model or the model type. It gets routed to a model that would be mostly appropriate for whatever that prompt is. But that's definitely an area of innovation that's happening right now. So.
Oh, say Warren, we're getting almost at the end of this podcast, which I think is a really good one. But I think I would be remiss if I didn't ask about search. I mean, Google's almost synonymous with search, and well, it is synonymous with search. And how is we've seen the ways you've started to integrate generative AI with search, and what's your roadmap for that, and how much we've seen that generative AI is probably not going to replace traditional search, but in what way is it going to be a new kind of hybrid going forward? Old school search and generative AI, or some other approach?
Yeah, so this is something that I'm super excited about. We do have Vertex AI search, which is Gen AI enabled. It's really cool, actually, because if I want to replace the search box on my website or in my internal stuff, you can use that to do that. But it also has another use, which is really interesting, which is when you ingest the information to be able to make that box work in this cool way, that data corpus that you create can also be used as your grounded corpus for your LLM for all other applications. So the fact that you ingested that documents, whatever data to use to be able to search against a catalog, whatever, now can that also be used as grounding your LLM? So you build other applications like recommender type things, or like, I want to find this video, whatever. You could use that corpus to do that in other places other than just a search box. The other piece is really grounding with Google search. And so we have enabled effectively grounding. You can ground on your corpus, which I just talked about, but you can ground on third parties like Moody's and Reuters type stuff, but you can also ground on Google search. And so you can turn that on and say, hey, by the way, when you answer this question and you want to know what the weather is in LA or whatever, use Google search to ground that answer in the latest truth. And so that will actually give you enterprise truth in that respects, because you can ground using Google search, which is the preeminent kind of like information place in the world. So that is something that any of our developers can turn on as part of using our models.
That's so cool. A final question is obviously, thank you so much for joining us. But what is the short and long term future of generative AI for you, Warren? You've been in the field for so long, and then what are your predictions for Google and the industry?
Google's going to do amazing things, and I can't make future-looking statements about the stock, so I won't. I think that I think the interesting thing is that it just becomes easier. Like we had this interesting step change where it was like, hey, a few years ago, it was like I'm building models and I needed X number of millions of pieces of data to build the model to do this little thing. Now I need way less data and even way less data. Now I need like 200 examples to actually tune the model specifically for what I want to do. And so we're getting to the place where you can actually have tools that allow you as a developer, without having to understand the sophistication of machine learning, you can use that to customize this for what you're trying to do. I think that in the near term future, that type of agency tool stuff that we talked about, this is just going to get better. And I also think that the kind of reasoning stuff that we talked about, like, hey, what should the logic be for this thing, as opposed to me writing it out, we're gonna see a lot of that coming up. But it's like an exciting place to be. And actually, funnily enough, that you talked to Jay Gal, so he's my guy out of New York. And so him and I are talking about how lucky we are to be at Google, because there's very few places on earth at the moment where we can be right in the middle and the heart of innovating in this space. And so I'm super excited about the next 12 months or so. even though I can only see about 4 or 5 out. So
That's funny. But thank you so much for joining us, Warren. We really appreciated having you and represent Google
Thank you so much.
and your own views. So to our listeners and now our viewers going forward, please catch up with Warren on LinkedIn. Check out all TT articles about Google Cloud and Google on our website. If you like this episode, whether it's the audio or the video version or both, please leave a review or a comment, and please also share this podcast interview. Thank you, and see you next time.